let's talk about Envoy of Jerusalem, your award-winning third installment
Yes.
in the series on Balian of Ibelin. So really good stuff. Yeah, I got to read it, and I was really excited by the book. The thing I really like about your books, Dr. Schroeder, is there's nothing in them that makes me cringe. You know how when you're reading a lot of historical fiction, you say, "No, that's not.
Why are you doing that?"
That's inaccurate. That's not what happened." And it's just I really appreciate the fact that you let the time period speak for itself, and you let that come through, and it makes it more interesting. So I appreciate that, and I think that's the great thing about good historical fiction is when it does give you access to this other time period.
Yeah. And it's not that easy. I mean, the research that goes into that is much wider than most people think. Because people tend to think that doing historical fiction is just about looking into the facts. And it's not about the facts. It's also about the society and the theology and I think it's really bizarre how a lot of historical authors go to huge efforts to get the technology right and then get the total social structures totally wrong and things like that. So what I always, and that's what normally makes me cringe, is that people have the right dates and they'll have the right, kind of weapons, and they'll describe, how a trebuchet works perfectly. And then they'll have, women riding around in armor, or they'll have,
right.
Something equally absurd, or they'll have what's something we've talked about a lot of times before, have the doctors all be incompetent and just hacking off people's hands, or they'll have no forms of sanitation, or they'll have all these horrible things, and yet, as I say, they technically have all their facts right.
Yeah. One thing especially I think that where that is relevant is the religion issue. A lot of people today really misunderstand medieval religion, medieval piety. They project this kind of modern prejudice back onto it. Oh, it's just a bunch of crazy, kooky bigots, But there's a lot of subtlety and beauty, really, I think, to medieval religiosity. And I really think you get it right, especially in regards to something like the Crusades, the religious significance of Jerusalem, the religious significance of this conflict, the Third Crusade. So, yeah, I think that's great. And yeah, the Third Crusade obviously is one of my absolute favorite time periods. And so I love the fact that, this is the point in your novel when we get into the Third Crusade. So, yeah, that was exciting for me. That might be one of the reasons it's my favorite of your books. But
thank you. But I also, personally, as someone, when I look back at my works, I think this is the best I've written so far.
It seems like
some of that, I suppose, you get better. Sometimes just because you get better as you learn your skills. But I think that the material here lent itself to a really, it's a book that doesn't just tell a story. It also has a theme. It has a very clear, so that you should be able to read this book, even if you're not interested in the Third Crusade, and come away feeling inspired.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I'll go ahead and get into our series of questions, I guess.
Okay.
Does that sound good to you?
Yep, absolutely.
Great. So this is just some talking points we had. I wanted to just get an idea about why you chose to write about Balian of Ibelin in the first place. I know we've discussed this in other venues before, but I think it's important for this. So who was he? What's so interesting about Balian of Ibelin to you?
Okay, well, Balian was the man who defended Jerusalem against Saladin in 1187. That's the basic fact. And it was a city at the time that was overflowing with refugees. And according to some contemporary accounts, there were roughly 50 men, women, and children for every fighting man in the city. So Balian, when he took over the defense, which was a voluntary thing, he actually was not in Jerusalem. He came to Jerusalem. He had a safe conduct from Saladin, and he could have just taken his wife and children out. But he agreed, the people in the city, all these refugees and the locals, begged him to stay because he was a baron and he had experience as a commander. And he took over that defense, although he knew it was doomed to failure. So that's the first thing where you say, why does somebody do that? And he would have been completely forgotten if he had failed. In other words, in fact, he did fail. One of the things is, so you have somebody who takes over defense in a hopeless situation. And if it had just been a hopeless defense and everybody had ended up being slaughtered, nobody would even remember his name. But he turned that hopeless situation through both military skills, because he held Saladin for enough days to make Saladin ready to negotiate. And then he negotiated so effectively, even though the city was already lost, that he managed to save probably 3/4 to I don't know, 80% of the population from the slaughter and slavery that would have been normal after a failed defense. And then comes what really attracted me about Balian was that when he does that negotiating, he doesn't just negotiate for himself and the wealthy and the established, but he literally negotiated until they agreed on a lump sum that would be raised from public and private sources to pay for the poor. Remember, I just said there was all these refugees. A lot of the people in Jerusalem had already lost everything. And Balian remembered them. He took them into account, and he negotiated for a lump sum that would be raised from other sources that these people wouldn't have to pay themselves to ransom the poor and the destitute. And then we get to the, ultra plus whatever. When the money that they raised was insufficient, Balian offered himself as a hostage until the balance could be raised. And this just, when I realized this, it was an act. This was a man who took his responsibilities as commander and as a Christian so seriously that he was willing to put himself back into privacy. He hadn't been captured. He was going to put himself in Saracen hands for the poor, not for his family, but for the poor. And I felt like that was, I really can't imagine any other commander of the Crusades, except St. Louis himself, who would have done a similar thing. So that's what really attracted me. And I have to stress here that this offer to give himself up, first the fact that he negotiated for the poor, and then that he offered to stand as a hostage so they could raise the sum, was recorded by Muslim sources. So that's recorded not by Balian's, squire or somebody who had a bias in favor of him. It's recorded as just sort of cold-blooded fact by the Muslim sources. And so it was this act that made Balian thematically worthy of a biographical novel. And then as you look into his life, you realize that there's all sorts of other interesting facts about him, such as marrying a dowager queen when he was only a landless knight, or seeking to bridge the differences between Tripoli and Lusignan, escaping the debacle at Hattin, and of course the fact that he negotiated with Richard the Lionheart, or between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. So I start with the fact that this is a man worthy of a biography because of what he did as a Christian. But then, as I learned about him, there's a whole story. There's a lot of interesting things that make it an exciting biography.
Yeah, absolutely. That was obviously one of the things that really struck me too about your series is the fact that Balian was willing to sacrifice himself for the poor of Jerusalem. It's kind of a timeless heroism, and I think that really comes through. It really comes through at the beginning of this book, especially when we have the aftermath of what happened at Jerusalem. There's that sense that I can't remember exactly what it was, but at the beginning of the book, he's feeling sort of this melancholy over what happened, because he doesn't save them all. Because although he offers himself, Saladin turns down his offer and takes the 1/4, the 15,000 is what the numbers recorded by Imad ad-Din, takes 15,000 basically women and children into slavery. So Balian feels he's failed. He tried to negotiate for them. He got a deal. He offered himself, but ultimately he fails. So the whole third part of the novel, the third volume, is basically Balian still struggling to get those 15,000 back. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he feels he failed them. Yeah, and that really comes through really well in the book, and I think that. That's the mark of somebody we can look back on in history and really admire. This is somebody who was very conscious of his role as a protector of the innocent, of the poor, and also, and he was a great warrior. On top of that, he wasn't. He had that aspect to him too. I mean, as you said, his conduct at Hattin. He's one of the few people at Hattin who really comes across well in terms of his skills in battle. So. Yeah, I
And
mean,
he defended Jerusalem well enough, as I say, he held it for, keep forgetting, 9 days,
absolutely, yeah.
you know, with women and children, with practically no fighting men in the city at all, which is a mark of somebody who organizes very well and inspired. He must have inspired those women and children and people who, and the priests. We can't forget that when we talk about non-combatants, that's also large numbers of monks and priests who were collected in Jerusalem, and we're not used to fighting. And for him to get them organized, probably in ways supporting, with food or passing the ammunition up or whatever, so that the few fighting men he had could deter or fight off the assaults. And at one point, they sallied out. They went all the way to the Saracen camp. They threw them out. They burned some of their siege engines. I mean, it wasn't just a passive defense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Balian's defense of Jerusalem, it's one of the great feats in the history of the Crusades. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So, Envoy of Jerusalem, again, it does focus to some extent on Balian's involvement in the Third Crusade, which I think that's really relevant. That brings something new to the table, because when we think about the Third Crusade, we often don't think about Balian of Ibelin immediately.
No.
But he did play a really important role, and your book helps that come through. So tell us about that. Do you think his role has been neglected? And what role did he play? How did Balian help shape events in the Third Crusade?
Well, yeah, it has been very neglected, of course, but that's in part because the sources don't throw it out there. With the death of William of Tyre in 1183, the Kingdom of Jerusalem lost its most credible historical voice. And even the Chronicle of Ernle, which of course we don't really have, we only have fragments of it, which have been copied by later chroniclers. We don't have a source that really puts out the case of how the events looked from the point of view of people in Outremer. And I should go on to say that really important thing about the Ernle chronicles that we have, or what's often called the Chronicles of Ernle, is we don't have the original. We don't have what Balian's squire wrote in French. What we have is Western scholars, Western chroniclers, mostly modest, clerics, using that document and working bits and pieces of it into their own documents. And I'm saying it sort of used their sources. They use Ernle the way Hollywood does history today. They use what they like of it, and they ignored anything that didn't fit their own little version of history. So we don't really have, as I say, the voice of Outremer in the sources that we have. So what you usually find in the history books of the Third Crusade, or what you normally find in history books about the Third Crusade, it's based on the documents or based on the perspective of Westerners. It's based on the Crusaders, their actions and how they saw events. It's not seen through the eyes of the people in Outremer. And Richard the Lionheart, of course, which we all love, is a real larger-than-life hero who dominates the Western chronicles, particularly the English chronicles, but even the French chronicles. And the barons and inhabitants of Outremer are generally ignored, or worse, they're sometimes even denigrated and put in a very negative light, sort of as the losers, the people responsible for the loss of the kingdom. It's their sins, or it was their incompetence, or it was their, the fact that they liked baths more than battles, I think is one of the phrases that's used. They're lumped together as a rather undifferentiated mass. When you turn to the Arab chronicles, they're much more nuanced in their treatment of their familiar opponents. But they also had no particular insight into the complex politics that were playing out during the Third Crusade. So to recognize Ibelin's role, you have to look below the surface of the accounts we have, and you have to piece together his role, sort of like a good detective, by taking the hints that are there and then putting together a whole picture. So, what you really have is the key hint, of course, is the assertion, I think it's by Baha'u'ddin, that Ibelin was like a king in the post-Hattin world. When you combine this remark with the fact that Ibelin fought his way off the field at Hattin, so he'd not lost either his freedom or his honor, that he gained further credibility by his outstanding defense of Jerusalem, and then was stepfather to the rightful queen of Jerusalem after the death of Sibylla in 1190, you begin to get a picture of just how important and respected he was. Ultimately, it was the fact that his name comes first after the then King of Jerusalem, Henri de Champagne, as a signatory of the Treaty of Ramla that really establishes without a doubt that Ibelin was considered the leading nobleman and the most senior baron of the kingdom. If you look at the records of any medieval kingdom, you can always tell the rank of a nobleman by where they are on a charter. So that the most senior baron in the realm will sign a charter first. Now, if this most senior baron isn't there, then the next person. But the order in which they sign always indicates their relative ranking. And Ibelin leads the lists every time he's on a charter, basically after a teen. So he was viewed by his fellows, by the barons of Outremer, as their, first among equals.
Yeah.
The next thing you have to look at is there's very, very hostile accounts of Isabella's divorce from Humphrey to Torn, and it was in that divorce that Ibelin, even in the Western chronicles, is pointed out as taking the lead. And he's taken the lead in securing the divorce and advocating her marriage to Conrad de Montferrat. The marriage of a female heir apparent was the responsibility of the High Court of Jerusalem. That's, you're going back to Melisenda, going back as far as you want. The High Court, that's one of the functions of the High Court, was to choose who an heiress would marry. So the fact that Ibelin was the leading baron mentioned in the whole negotiations for Isabella's divorce and remarriage is again indicative of the fact that he was seen as the leading baron of the kingdom, but he was not acting alone. He would have been acting as a spokesman for the High Court, even, to the extent that High Court reconstituted itself. Again, it didn't really exist officially, but the function of the barons still thought in terms of there being a High Court, and every baron was a member of the High Court. Every knight actually was a member of the High Court. And they are going to assert their right to choose the heir, the husband for Isabella. And the fact that Ibelin's name is listed and not all, how many of them were around, is because Ibelin Balian was the spokesman of that High Court. We also know that, the men of Outremer formed one of the contingents of Richard's armies. So we can assume that the man who successfully commanded the rear guard at Hattin was there. We can assume, Balian was at this point, as I say, still was one of the most effective, most respected fighting men of Outremer. If there are men from Outremer fighting, Balian's there, although his name is...
So he was at the Battle of Arsuf too, right? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying, I can't, how do I prove it? I can't prove it.
Right, okay.
I can only say, we know that at the Battle of Arsuf, the barons, there was a contingent, there was what do you call it, a troop or a division that was formed by the men of Outremer. Well, who else was leading it?
Right, yeah.
Tell me, it sure the hell wasn't Guy de Lusignan.
Yeah, because Guy was put with a contingent of Richard's men, right?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
And Conrad de Montferrat was refusing to take part. Mm-hmm. So if Balian's the leading lord of the realm, he's the spokesman of the High Court, he's seen as the senior baron, he's the one, and he's the one who commanded the rear guard at Hattin effectively, and the defense. So again, it isn't he isn't explicitly mentioned, but when you hear the barons of Outremer, you can assume Ibelin's there. You can assume Balian's there. The same thing's true of when they talk about the barons of Outremer and the Hospitallers and the Templars advised Richard not to attack Jerusalem or not to assault Jerusalem. And now we get to another point. If you're Richard the Lionheart, and we know that Richard was a very intelligent, very savvy commander who was very concerned about intelligence and went to a great deal of effort to learn as much about his opponents and about the topography and everything else. Richard was not just someone who barged in, did whatever he thought was right. He really went to a great deal of effort to learn about the environment in which he was fighting. If you're assaulting a city and you have in your army somebody who had commanded the defense of that city 5 years earlier, you're going to tell me you didn't talk to him?
Right, yeah.
Richard had the absolute gem, and what the kind of thing that most commanders, dream and pray for, He has somebody who knows exactly what the defenses of Jerusalem looked like and what it took to defend the system, fighting with him. And I think that's where you get the basis probably of the trust between Richard and Balian, because Richard would have had to turn to him and say, okay, I'm going to attack the city. You defended that city. What's it like? What are the defenses like? Tell me about it. Draw them for me. Explain them to me. Where are the weaknesses? What were you afraid of? Obviously, that conversation would have taken place, even though it's, again, not mentioned. Then we have the incident at Jaffa when the barons of Outremer actually formed, and along with the Hospitallers and the Templars, formed the relief force. You remember, Richard is up in Tyre, or was in Acre. I think it was in Tyre.
Beirut, right? Or wait, no, he's going to go to. He's in Acre.
He wasn't in Beirut. They hadn't taken Beirut.
Right, yeah.
He was trying. He would have. That's what Richard was focused on next, was reestablishing that. A continuous coastal Christian control of the coast. But that's why I'm pretty sure he was in Tyre, which was the most northern city held at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets word that Saladin's threatening Jaffa, and he immediately goes aboard, I think it was 4 or 5 ships, and he sails down to Jaffa to reinforce the garrison and to assure them that help is on the way. But the main force, which couldn't all get on ships, is a land force commanded by Henri de Champagne as the now king of Jerusalem, because in the meantime he's married Isabella. And they start down the coast and get as far as Caesarea when they're blocked by a large force of Saracen troops. I think our friend...
Dr. Stephen Donachie?
Yes, he pointed out that Saladin no longer had the bulk of his troops around Jaffa, because once he'd taken the city, all he had was this, garrison trapped up in the citadel, and he would have pulled the bulk of his armies out. Cavalry's worthless in a siege, anyways, and had them blocking that road. So the land army coming down the coast is initially commanded by Henri de Champagne, and then Henri does something which I think is terribly irresponsible as a commander. He gets on a ship himself with one ship and a few, 40 archers or something, and absconds down the coast to join Richard, which of course doesn't really help Richard at all, because 40 more men, more or less, isn't going to do a great deal of difference there. And there's nobody says who takes over the command of that relief force. So I cannot, put my hand in fire saying it was Balian of Ibelin, but there's a pretty good chance it was, because he's the senior, baron in the kingdom, and he's the experienced commander who, as I say, has not lost his reputation or honor at Hattin. And who else is gonna? So, and you didn't. By the way, Templars and Hospitallers didn't command the armies of Outremer. They commanded contingents. They commanded their own contingents in those armies, but a feudal army was never turned over to the Hospitallers, the Templars. So the most reasonable guess for who commanded that relief force was, in fact, Balian of Ibelin. And then, of course, last but not least, Ibelin was Richard's envoy to Saladin and played a key role in negotiating the Treaty of Ramla, which ended the Third Crusade. And again, I don't think Richard would have turned over that important and difficult task to Balian of Ibelin if he hadn't already built up a very strong, relationship and trust, and they hadn't by that point become, really comrades in arms.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. The fact that Richard trusts Balian with that, I think that says a lot about his importance in the Third Crusade and the Treaty of Ramla. Obviously, this is hugely crucial to the Third Crusade, and Balian really comes across strongly in the Muslim sources for his role in that negotiation. I think the respect he tended to have in Saladin's camp comes across there too. So yeah, I think that's interesting too that you talk about how Balian supported Conrad as king of Jerusalem. I think that says a lot about Conrad's fittingness as a commander. He must. We know that he was a good military man because of his ability to hold on to Tyre and effectively defend Tyre. But I think that says something that Balian was willing to back Conrad about. Yeah, go ahead.
We have to keep in mind what were his options, because the first thing that's very clear is that Humphrey de Torrent was not acceptable to the barons of Outremer. Period. Mm-hmm. Humphrey de Torrent had betrayed them when they had been waiting to crown him king as an alternative, as a rival to Guy de Lusignan when Sibylla and Guy usurped the throne in 1186. And the barons, at Nablus, meeting at Balian's castle, his wife's dower portion, the bulk of the high court. It was not all of the members of the high court, but Tripoli was there, and Caesarea, and Tiberias, of course, Tripoli. They had been willing to crown Isabella as a more legitimate, because Sibylla had then usurped the crown without the support of the high court, and they therefore were planning to crown Isabella as the legitimate crown, as the choice of the high court queen, as the choice of the high court, and her husband. She was married already to Humphrey de Toron, and Humphrey goes in the night and does homage to Sibylla and Guy, and thereby makes the entire coup, or the entire counter actions by the high court null and void, or impossible. The barons would never forgive him for that.
Yeah.
Basically, Humphrey is seen as a person who betrays them in 86, and because he betrayed them, they got Guy de Lusignan, and because they got Guy de Lusignan, they got Hattin. Because of Hattin, they'd lost the kingdom. Humphrey was unacceptable. So the barons had to get rid of Humphrey. So who were they going to marry Isabella to? And this is where, Conrad de Montferrat was probably the best, option on the table, because he was fresh blood. Otherwise, he would have had to choose among them, which is always a very divisive thing. It was probably easier to choose one outsider. And he'd done the spectacular defense of Tyre. So there was a sense, okay, he's proved that he's a fighting man, as Humphrey de Toron isn't. And he's an outsider, so none of us have to be, fighting with each other about who's going to be the next king. And he was, of course, extremely well connected. He was, first cousin to Philip II, and he was related to the Holy Roman Emperor. So it was a good choice, but I don't think we should, I don't think they had a lot of options. Let me just put it that way.
Yeah. So Ernol, the squire of Balian, he plays a fairly prominent role in your novel. I find him to be just kind of an interesting character. Do we know anything about him historically, just beyond his name and the fact that he was Balian's squire?
Not really. There's a very, very boring dissertation, and because I'm in Greece and not at home, I don't have it in my shelf in front of me, which tries to sort out who he really was, and comes to the conclusion that he was probably a younger son from the house of Gibelin, so another was a younger son of a baron of Outremer, and that he was later a prominent figure in the kingdom of Cyprus. The name was probably more familiar to us as Arnold, Arnold. Another Arnold is sort of a French version of Arnold, and therefore some of the records on Cyprus use the more familiar form. But that's about all people can pull together. As I say, we don't actually have his original document, which might have a lot more in it. All we have is these excerpts. The idea of turning him into a troubadour as well as a historian is completely literary license on my part. But I would say in my own defense that quite a few of the barons and knights of Outremer were poets and musicians. And of course, as Richard the Lionheart was himself, too. And we know that Balian's older brother, or I discovered recently that Balian's older brother, Baldwin, actually translated Arab poetry into French, which is a fact I really wish I'd known earlier, because I would have changed Baldwin. I would have at least mentioned it in the earlier volume. The Ibelins in the 13th century, particularly Balian's son, was also John of Root, was also, and his grandson, John of Jaffa, were both very famous as patrons of the arts. So I thought having a troubadour in Balian's household was a reasonable invention.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Saladin also. Obviously, Saladin plays a huge role in this book. Mm-hmm. And I really liked your portrayal of him. For me, personally, the way I've experienced Saladin through the sources, and especially just through what we know about his political career, I feel like you were getting at a more accurate view of Saladin. Especially Saladin, he's highly romanticized in a lot of portrayals of him. He's made out to be sort of this reluctant commander. He almost just would have preferred if everyone could have been at peace in Jerusalem. In fact, there's a movie that came out not too long ago
I don't know if you've seen it, Arn, the Knight Templar, where Saladin is an important character. And there's even a part in the movie where he says, if only everyone could just stop fighting over Jerusalem and share her. That's actually a line they put in Saladin's mouth, which is very, I mean, for those of us who actually study him as a historical figure and look at what he was like, I mean, that's not what this man was like. This was a guy who was, he was a committed politician. He was committed to his own dynasty's power. And I think,
absolutely.
Yeah, I think Andrew Ehrenkreutz makes a very strong argument that he was committed to his dynasty, the Ayyubid dynasty's power, ahead of just simply Muslim victory over Christendom. I mean, that was a priority for him too, but he wasn't willing to, for example, hand over Egypt's power to Nur ad-Din, who had been his sponsor from the Zengids. So there's that about him, and I think that comes across in your book. You know, I think he comes across as this is a warlord, a commander who is holding together some disparate elements within the Muslim camp, these different tribal groups, these different emirs and that sort of thing, and their followings. And he's an effective politician. He's an effective commander. And I think the fact that he's a pious Muslim also comes across in your book too. But I think it's just a lot more accurate. So what did you find most interesting about Saladin? Like, what kind of insights about him came across to you as you were researching him and writing him as a character? And how did that kind of influence the direction of the book?
I'm going to say I probably didn't learn anything more about him than what you've already said. I think, the idea that he was a paragon of virtue or that he was very chivalrous or something is utter nonsense. And if people who are still repeating that today are showing their own laziness, because they're obviously just repeating these these things, 19th century versions of Saladin. I haven't bothered to look at any more recent scholarship. Clearly, exactly what you said. He was a very hard-headed, very astute politician, and I respect him for that because, as you just mentioned, he had to hold together a very diverse fighting force, an empire, which was, I think, is often overlooked. There's this use of the term Saracen or even Muslim, sort of band-aids over how diverse that group or the people fighting, or what we call Saracens, really were. So that was, that's one of the learn, just the very fact that, of course, Saladin himself is a Kurd, that there's Turks, but the Turks aren't a solid group either. They're actually made up of a lot of different Turkmenim tribes. Then you have Arabs, but the Arabs isn't a single group. There's Bedouins, there's Egyptians, there's, people coming out of Arabia. There's also Nubians, there's also, all sorts of peoples who all have their own cultures, some to a certain extent, their own language. Arabic was a good lingua franca. It was a uniting language because it was the language of the Quran. But the average soldier didn't necessarily speak it or speak it well. And they had different, as I say, traditions. They had different weapons. They had different tactics. And anybody, who could pull together a coalition of these forces and, use them as an effective force, that's something that's very admirable. Mm-hmm. And it took a tremendous amount of skill. So that's something that I certainly respect Saladin for. Of course, I did know that he spent more time fighting his fellow Muslims than fighting the Christians, but that is not to take away from the fact that he did declare jihad, and he did declare his desire to destroy all the Christians out of the entire world, not just out of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. So saying if we could all just get along, those are the kind of things that puts the hair on the back of my neck to stand up, because it's just so far away. It's just the opposite. He brought jihad practically. Mm-hmm. There was a little bit under Nur ad-Din, but he was the one who really used it as a force to unite that you can even argue that he used it as a lot of dictators and tyrants have used over the time about it, the external threat as a means to unite internal factions. So to what extent did he use jihad simply because he, as a Kurd, was trying to hold together such a diverse empire? That's, I think we can argue that. I think I told you at some point, one of the funnest conversations I had was a very, very devout Saudi, or half Saudi, South Ethiopian Muslim who came to me and said, I see you're writing about Jerusalem. Why on earth did Saladin want Jerusalem? It's not important to Islam.
Right.
You sit
That's
there,
interesting.
snapping for air and saying, "Well, you're actually right about that. I'm glad you said that." Actually, yes, you're right. Jerusalem really isn't important to Islam. So why was he doing it? Well, was it the ports? Was it, to have a common enemy? What was it? Just because it was part of the jihadist? Not Jerusalem itself that's important. It's just getting rid of those Christians. It's expanding the Dar al-Islam. So I think. The bottom line is I don't think I know that much about Saladin. I don't think I've penetrated to what really made him tick. I don't pretend to. My book's about Balian, not about Saladin. It would be a different, I would have to try to understand him from the inside out if I was trying to write a biography or a biographical novel about Saladin. My Saladin essentially is, first of all, I did want it to be accurate. I wanted to reflect that he was a very effective commander, that he was definitely devoted to destroying the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem and the Christian states, Crusader states. But at the same time, Saladin is for me is a symbol. He's not just an individual. He represents his culture and Muslim attitudes of this period. Mm-hmm. So he plays a role. The novel's working at multiple levels here, and Balian is a symbol, basically, of, to me, the ultimate Christian nobleman who is willing to sacrifice his own well-being, possibly even his own freedom, etc., for the collective, for the poor, in a very Christ-like way. But he's still a nobleman. I'm not saying he's not Christ, but he's saying this is a Christian nobleman in the best school. And that's sort of what he symbolized. Saladin also symbolizes Muslim attitudes of the time. And he's shown very explicitly as a misogynist slaveholder. And I've been actually disappointed, a little bit shocked by how many people have told me that they like my positive portrayal. And I'm sitting here saying, really? You mean you think it's okay to have little boys waiting on you and bowing down to you? And you really approve of men having dozens of concubines and laughing about raping? And, part of me finds that rather frightening.
Yeah, I think that is kind of interesting because that's a big part of your book. I mean, I really liked the fact that you included the fate of the Christian women who fell into slavery after the fall of Jerusalem. In fact, you even had a character who...
Two, yeah.
Yeah.
Essentially one, yeah.
Yeah.
She and her sister.
Right. You had these characters, these female characters from Jerusalem. You kind of gave them a voice, which I thought that was really beautiful and important because I think it's almost kind of an injustice the way the sort of Christian casualties of Saladin's conquests and his imperialism and his, this mass enslavement that happened after the fall of Jerusalem in 1187, their voices are kind of so often silenced by it's overlooked. I think we can admire these positive qualities of Saladin and not without trying to cover up and sort of whitewash the fact that these innocent Christian women and children suffered as a result of what happened in 1187. Lord knows we give voices to those who suffered in 1099 after the Crusader conquest. I mean, that's always talked about. But anyway, I really liked that about your book. And I like the fact that you include Imad ad-Din was actually a character in your book, a very, very minor one. But Imad ad-Din, this man who was very prominent in Saladin's court, and he appears in your novel, and in fact, his attitude about the Christian women who were captured in 1187 is portrayed and really well done. I think you even include that passage, don't you?
I did. I did. I used the verbatim quote from his own history because I knew if I just had him talking that way, people would say, "Oh, you're just Islamic phobic, and this is just bringing up all these cliches." And I said, "No. I'm going to quote him, and I'm going to put it on the footnote of the page, not as an endnote, not in my historical note, right there, exactly where it is, which passages, which paragraphs, because people don't want to accept that really." They really did, I don't know how to say, triumph about torturing and abusing people.
Yeah, the rape of these women was a point of pride and triumph for them. It is horrifying. Yes. I mean, and actually, it's kind of funny you mentioned as we talk about that passage. One of the first videos I ever made for Real Crusades history was about that passage specifically, kind of pointing out, well, hey, I mean, look, let's remember that 1187 was it created a very negative situation, and for these Christian women from Jerusalem, they were abused, and yet for years since then, since I've made that video, people will always say, "This is a lie. You've made this up. It's like, well, this is in the source. Where'd you get your source? Post your source." And I'm thinking, the source is there. I posted the source. Yeah. But yeah, that's why I think it's important to, be honest about this history. And again, that's one of the things I appreciate about this book you wrote. So yeah. Let's move on a little bit. I wanted to kind of talk about Richard the Lionheart also. I mean, the book is, Balian is the main character of the book. I think Saladin and Richard kind of play these important roles too. That's
why they're on the cover.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richard and Saladin are facing each other. Exactly.
They are, yeah. I think Balian's role within that kind of like amid that conflict between these two figures is really interesting. So Richard he's one of the most dynamic characters in the book. I was always excited when I got to a part of the book where Richard was involved. I mean, part of that, I think I love Richard the Lionheart. He's one of my favorite figures from history. But I thought, again, what I know about Richard as a historical figure, it comes across in this book. It really does. And that for me was a breath of fresh air too, because so often it's not in there's been so many novels about that take place during the Third Crusade, and Richard tends to come across as just kind of this, sort of the bravado sort of cowboy kind of image. But I think you captured Richard as a strategist, as a great general. I liked that, So
thank you.
So what stands out to you about Richard in your research, in your portrayal?
Well, yeah, as you say, Richard the Lionheart, as the name says it all, is, intimidating even after 800 years. I really was a little afraid of him. And then when I got to, as you say, reading about him, I just had to like him. So that made it easier to write. But he was highly controversial even in his own lifetime. We shouldn't forget. And of course, he still is. So I tried to do enough research to form my own opinion. And I learned some things that I thought were quite surprising, like the fact that he identified more strongly with Aquitaine than England or Normandy, because he actually went and lived there from, I don't know what he was, younger than 14, but he was fairly young when he went and joined his mother in Aquitaine. I was also, because he's so often portrayed as the man who hounds his father to his death, and I always liked Henry II. I sort of grew up with The Lion in Winter and those kinds of things. And Henry II was really one of England's great kings, and Richard is often normally portrayed as the horrible, son that hounded him to his death. When you get closer into the story of Richard, you find out that he and his father fought together many, many more years than they ever fought against each other. Mm-hmm. And they actually had a very good working relationship. Several times Richard got himself in trouble in Poitou and the Aquitaine, and his father would come and bail him out, bring the troops down, and knock his enemies aside, and get Richard out of trouble. And so I think that a lot of the hostility, the horrible, bitter end was in part because Richard was so incredibly disappointed. The love-hate, how close love and hate is. I think he probably loved his father, and he just couldn't stomach the fact that his father refused to name him his heir, and then he becomes, that festering wound to something that would Philip II use. Anyways, so when I was studying, I thought I came to a lot better understanding of Richard as probably much more complex, and as I say, the relationship with his father being more complex. I also found a lot of evidence that his marriage to Berengaria was not as bad as it's usually depicted. But what impressed me most was really still his intelligence, his financial savvy, for example. He was brilliant at raising funds, selling Cyprus twice. You can't get better than that. And his diplomatic skills would come out more after he was released from the German prison, after he's been ransomed. The way he systematically broke down Philip II's alliances, and one by one got new allies, and probably would have won the war if he hadn't been killed. So. Those things are all things that I had not known about Richard, and I found very interesting. Or things like his willingness to do physical labor and his ease with his troops. This was somebody who didn't have to stand on dignity. his ability to make compromises. In so many novels and movies, he's shown as a buffoon and just arrogant. Just this one incident with him throwing down the Duke of Austria's flag has made everybody depict him as someone who's just so boorishly self-interested, and it's all just about his pride that he makes these enemies without thinking about things. Well, no, it's really not that simple, because if you had your flag up, it means you got a share of the spoils. And actually, there was a deal with Philip, and Philip probably would have thrown the banner down too. And but Philip just wasn't the kind of person who went out and did that. And no, in retrospect, it was a stupid thing to do, but he wasn't consistently,
right. That one incident doesn't justify somehow condemning his whole career when the rest of his career is so impressive, I think.
Yeah. So in the end, I just had to love him despite his faults. And that's obviously reflected in the book, because I found him a fun character to write about. And I think that always makes it easier to write.
Yeah.
If you like.
He's very dynamic. Yeah. So what are some of your favorite passages from the book, and why? If you just want to throw a few of those out at us.
Well, I personally like the scene where Ibelin seeks out Magnuson in the Harborside Tavern. So that was fun. Or Ernest's exuberance when he hears other people singing his own song. That's sort of, I think, the artist in me. You always get excited when you say, somebody's reading my book. Oh, wow, this is exciting. I like Ibelin's confrontation with Tauron after the latter's release, because he lays out, I think it was an opportunity to lay out why the barons hated Tauron and why he was unacceptable. And I think most people don't realize the extent to which they saw him as the reason that they had Hattin, the reason that they had the Lost Kingdom. Certainly one of the most important scenes, talking about Tauron, is the ecclesiastical inquiry into Isabella's marriage. And for me, when she's listening behind the curtains to the interrogation of Humphrey, and he refuses to take up the gauntlet to fight for her, because every indication is that she loved him and she didn't really want the divorce. And then he's not even willing to fight for her. And I thought, for a young woman, that just must have been devastating. I like all the exchanges between Richard and Ibelin. I just think, from the first one where they clash to the end where they're working together, it's just I think those scenes work well. Or Alice's stage fright is one of the other ones. And then I guess I also like the scene where Maria Jimena has to tell Isabella that her husband's been mortally wounded by assassins, and she has to go down into the Great Hall and let him die in her arms. I think, as a woman, that's an incredible scene. And then all the scenes where Balian negotiates with Saladin. So
yeah, that was some.
That's
of my
probably too many. What scenes did you like, Jay?
Actually, yeah, the part towards the end where Balian is negotiating with Saladin, that is some of my favorite stuff. Because yeah, I have never seen that portrayed anywhere, and it's such an interesting aspect of the Third Crusade, and it's kind of a crowning moment too, in some respect for Balian, at least for.
That's what it's supposed to be, because when he gets right down to it, these two things that are important to him: trying to get the slaves back, and Ibelin, which he's lost, and he has to sacrifice Ibelin. And I have no historical basis. He'll come right out and saying that he cut that deal. All we know is that the border's just short of Ibelin, and here he is negotiating the treaty, and we're talking 8 miles.
Yeah.
We're talking nothing. And you would have expected the negotiator to say, oh, by the way, we'll draw the line, just a little south of Ibelin, if you don't mind, that little 6 miles or whatever, 18 miles, a little further, So the very fact that neither Ibelin nor Ramla, his inheritance, he's negotiating the treaty, but he doesn't get his own, and they weren't terribly important pieces, says to me, he must have gotten something else he wanted and made it that choice between your material and the immaterial, or between the material and the spiritual, that he had to decide.
Yeah.
He just stayed.
So I liked that scene a lot. I also the Battle of Arsuf was probably one of my favorite parts of the book. I kind of knew it would be ahead of time, but I've seen that battle done in such a poor way so many times in so many books. It's just kind of. I liked the fact that you actually got into more what the sources tell us about that battle, and we got a sense too of that moment when the charge actually happened wasn't just premature necessarily like we often are led to believe, that it was the right moment to make that charge. So
that I actually got from our great discussion with Steve Donaghy,
yeah,
Professor Donaghy, because when we were discussing that came out to me so clearly. Yes, this was
Yeah.
at Marshall Hospital. This is not some stupid knight from the West who doesn't know what he's doing. This is one of the most seasoned commanders in Outremer, and Richard couldn't be everywhere at the same time. We don't know that he wouldn't have made the same decision if he happened to be on that salient of the front. So I found that, such a compelling argument that I decided to throw it in.
Yeah. And another part of the book that kind of stuck with me all through it was that scene at the beginning where I think it's where Balian and his wife Maria Comnena first see each other after he had defended Jerusalem, and after they weren't sure if he'd even survived. I thought that was a really compelling scene, and I like I really like Balian's relationship with Maria throughout the series. I think that's Maria Comnena is another neglected personality.
Yes.
Yeah.
Maligned because she supported the High Court and Isabella's marriage to Conrad de Montferrat. She's portrayed as this witch, and historian, even Bernard Hamilton say, this conniving, intriguing woman. I said, where's the evidence? Show me one single incident, besides the fact that she supported the High Court in what was a right decision to get rid of an incompetent coward and marry the ruling queen to a competent military leader. She put the interests of the kingdom ahead of the interests of her, or the affections of her daughter, and that speaks well for her. It's not to her blame that she did that. And there's no other time when she interfered in the affairs of the kingdom. So yes, that's very important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, it's a really good book. I enjoyed it, and I'm hoping that everybody who's listening, if you haven't been able to get a copy of Envoy of Jerusalem yet, that you will pick it up and read it. I think it's worth getting. Historical fiction, it's always been one of my favorite genres, even though so many of the historical fiction novels I've read in my life have left me disappointed / frustrated / infuriated, whatever. But the thing I love about historical fiction is we can kind of get into the minds and the feelings of this period of time, of these people. That's the thing that I always find frustrating about medieval history, is that the sources are so laconic, if you will.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. And so this is a way we can try to get into that more human aspect of the period and these amazing events that we find so fascinating. And I think you do a great job with it, Dr. Schroeder, in this book. So I think Envoy of Jerusalem is one of my it's really one of my favorite novels set during the Third Crusade and that deals with the Crusades. So I'm really glad you have taken up this labor of love, if you will.
Thank you very, very much. They were fun to write. They were emotionally good, fun to write. Difficult. But
it's a lot of work writing a novel. I mean, I know that because I've done it myself, and it's a really hard thing to do because you have to sit there, kind of in the quiet and just do it, right?
Absolutely, but incredibly rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you get it right. As I say, I think I've written somewhere how I get haunted by the ghosts, so to speak, of people. When you write about real characters, there's a sense of, if I'm getting it wrong, they're going to come out of the woodwork. They're going to, how dare you do that? And then I read, as you said, these other books by people, and I think, well, obviously they're not afraid of the ghosts coming out and getting them because they're so bad.
Yeah, if only that were true, that would probably prevent a lot more poor writing, I think. But
would ruin a lot of Hollywood, yeah.
But I know what you mean. I mean, you write about these historical figures, and you do a lot of research on them. You do as much as you can, and you kind of come to make a connection with these particular personalities who are important in the book. Yeah. So it is rewarding, and it really helps you understand a period of time better, a particular slice of history.
Hopefully, as you say, the sources themselves are so dry and so, fragmented, that it's very, very hard to get a feel just from reading them. I think, you and I do it because we start piecing together all the different pieces. And I say you do a lot of detective work and you look at different things and you start to pull together a mosaic. But for the person who doesn't want to spend that much time, a good historical novel can do it for them.
Yeah.
The risk is that a lot of people don't put enough effort into trying to get it right.
Is there anything else you wanted to add about your book, Dr. Schroeder, as we come to the end here?
You had, in the questions you sent to me, you had mentioned, who did I like best? And obviously, we sort of discussed that Balian and Maria Helena and Richard himself are sort of my favorite historical characters. I did also want to mention that Amory de Lusignan is another one of those characters that I really like because he's also one of the people often misrepresented in literature, actually a very, very competent person. So that was one of the fun things I had in this novel was preparing the reader for the fact that he's actually very different from his brother and having him set up a little bit as a counterpoint to Guy and not just lumping him together and making him a larger or more evil Guy de Lusignan as I've seen done in other novels. Because, you and I both know that in fact he goes on and was king of Jerusalem for considerably longer. It was about 8 times as long as his brother and did a very, very good job. Also pulled together some of the laws of Jerusalem, etc.
Some territory was recovered under him too.
Correct. Yeah. Beirut. They had the coast back going north. And the other thing is that I did want to say, I had a couple of my fictional characters, which I think are very important because someone like Sir Bartholomew is essential to the novel. He's as essential, let's say, as vassals and tenants were to the feudal society. He's the salt of the earth. He's, we all hear about the barons and the title, but they all had to have their knights. They had to have household knights. They had to have, a body of troops to make up that, chivalry. But he also represents all fathers who've lost and have missing children, So he embodies the terrible suffering of survivors of a catastrophe. The ones who are still there, although their loved ones have been washed away. So I think he's a very important for giving a voice to the spiritual doubts of men when they're confronted with loss and grief. And I also, Alice, who's my tavern singer, she sings for all her sisters trapped in hopeless situations after a lost war. She's also a voice for the Syrian refugees today, or for those in South Sudan or Somalia. And she represents, the women millions of women who've lost their homes and families and livelihoods and have nothing left to sell but a song or their bodies. I mean, the last of mine, Håkon Magnusson, represents the independent crusader, because we both know that not everybody came in organized crusades, that a lot of people came on their own just to fill a vow or atone for a sin. And so I thought, who better to represent that independent spirit than a Norseman? So,
yeah, I liked that character too.
It's hard to compete with Richard the Lionheart and Balian and Saladin, but I really did try to put into the novel some of those people that don't have voices, that don't make it into the chronicles, that don't make it into the historical record, but in fact represent many, many more people than those, high-profile kings and barons.
Yeah, I liked Sir Bartholomew. Bartholomew. I liked him too as a character. I like the fact that we get to see Balian's relationship with one of his household knights, one of his vassals. That's something we don't seem to see a lot in fiction, is kind of the way that worked between a lord and the men who would be on the ground, the knights that were in the action. So, really good book, and I certainly recommend it to everybody listening. Envoy of Jerusalem by Dr. Helena Schroeder. And also for those of you listening, Dr. Schroeder does weekly blog posts for Real Crusades history, which those have been very enjoyable, and I'm glad you're doing them.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Good. So we can find more stuff about your novels actually at realcrusadeshistory.com. The link to your novels on their Amazon pages individually are there, and also Dr. Schroeder's got her blog Defending Crusader Kingdoms, which
but that's actually merged with Real Crusades History, so that the entries on both are the same. There is a whole website though called defenderofjerusalem.com, which collects the blog entries sort of by category.
Okay.
So whereas the blog comes sort of randomly, so what happened this week, the website has them organized by Crusades, society, reviews, biographies, whatever. So for people who are looking for something specific, it's probably easier to navigate through the website.
Yeah. Yeah, and I will have that linked in the information box below this video, below this podcast. So, yeah. So, again, this has been Real Crusades History. J. Stephen Roberts with Dr. Helena Schroeder talking about Envoy of Jerusalem. Thanks so much for being with us, Dr. Schroeder.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity.
For more information, just go to realcrusadeshistory.com. You can actually go there and get a copy of Envoy of Jerusalem as well. So thank you. Thanks for watching. Click the subscribe button below to subscribe to this channel. To support Real Crusades History, click on the link to our Patreon in the box below this video. Also, you will find a link to my novel, Why Does the Heathen Rage? A tale of the Crusades set during the reign of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. Check out Scott Amos's novel, To Shine with Honor, a story of the First Crusade. Also, check out Helena Schroeder's biographical novel of Balian of Ibelin, Envoy of Jerusalem. Please click on the link below to like our Facebook page as well. You can also join the Real Crusades History discussion group on Facebook. Thank you.